Have you ever witnessed a moment so powerful it left everyone speechless? Today's story takes us to a grocery store in Compton, California, where an ordinary afternoon turned into an unforgettable life lesson. It's a story about courage, dignity, and standing up to ignorance, featuring none other than the legendary rapper Snoop Dogg. But this isn't just about him, it's about all of us and the values we stand for. Picture this: Snoop Dogg, dressed in his signature casual style, walking through the aisles with a basket in hand. Suddenly, an elderly woman confronts him with shocking words, "Go back to Africa." The tension in the room grows as all eyes turn to Snoop. What happens next is not just unexpected, it's transformative. Moments like these don't just test the people directly involved. They challenge everyone watching to reflect on their own beliefs and actions. They remind us that every word, every choice, and every reaction can shape the world around us. Before we move on, if this story is already sparking your curiosity, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell. Your support helps us share more powerful stories like this. Now, let's dive into the next part, where an ordinary trip to the store becomes a moment that redefines the meaning of dignity and grace. It was a sunny afternoon in Compton, California, a neighborhood rich in culture, history, and resilience. The grocery store buzzed with the sounds of everyday life, carts rattling, soft chatter, and the occasional beep from the registers. For many, it was just another day, a routine stop to pick up fresh produce, essentials, and maybe catch a familiar face in the aisles. Snoop Dogg, a local legend and global icon, was no stranger to these streets. Despite his fame, he remained deeply connected to the community where he grew up. That day, he strolled into the store dressed in his signature laid-back style, a blue hoodie with Compton emblazoned across the front, jeans, and sneakers. To most people, he was just another customer, blending effortlessly into the rhythm of the day. Near the produce section, an elderly woman named Mrs. Thompson was adjusting her glasses. She appeared to be in her late 70s, her silver hair neatly pinned back, wearing a faded cardigan that hinted at a bygone era. Her posture was stiff, her movements precise as she examined a bag of apples. She seemed like the kind of person who stuck to her routines and preferred things a certain way. The air was unremarkable, a typical day by all accounts, until their paths crossed. As Snoop reached for a bag of oranges, texting on his phone with the ease of someone juggling multiple tasks, Mrs. Thompson noticed him. Her gaze lingered longer than usual, her expression shifting from curiosity to disapproval. At first, nothing was said. The unspoken tension hung in the air, unnoticed by most of the other shoppers. Snoop, immersed in his phone, seemed oblivious. But then, without warning, Mrs. Thompson spoke. "You people don't belong here," she said, her voice cutting through the hum of the store. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even subtle. Her words carried across the produce aisle, loud enough for several nearby shoppers to hear. Snoop froze mid-text, his fingers hovering over the screen. Slowly, he looked up, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, it seemed like time itself had paused, as if emboldened by the silence. Mrs. Thompson continued, her tone sharper, more pointed. "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The words landed like a heavy blow, not just on Snoop, but on everyone within earshot. A hush fell over the produce section, the usual clatter and chatter evaporating into an uneasy stillness. Some shoppers exchanged awkward glances, unsure of how to react. Others pretended not to hear, their faces buried in grocery lists or the nearest display of fruits. Snoop stood motionless, his basket in one hand, his phone in the other, his brow furrowed. And for a moment, it looked like he might respond immediately, but instead, he took a deep breath. His expression shifted, not to anger, but to something calmer, more deliberate. Mrs. Thompson, still clutching her apples, stood her ground, her chin lifted slightly, as if daring him to respond. Around them, the atmosphere grew heavier. A young mother quickly ushered her child toward another aisle, while a store employee stacking bananas froze mid-motion, his hands gripping a crate of fruit. The silence stretched, uncomfortable and thick. as if the entire store had been plunged into a collective state of disbelief. It was clear that everyone was waiting to see what Snoop would do, waiting to see how this would unfold. For Snoop, this was more than just a confrontation. It was a moment that echoed centuries of struggle, resilience, and identity. The weight of those words, "Go back to Africa," wasn't new. They carried the same sting they had for generations, a reminder of exclusion and ignorance. But this wasn't just about him. It was about the people watching, the lessons this moment could teach, and the example he could set. Mrs. Thompson remained defiant, her stance unyielding. Her words, harsh as they were, reflected a mindset rooted in fear and misunderstanding. And yet, as Snoop stood there, the tension in the room wasn't just about her words. It was about the ripple effect they would cause. The crowd around them, though small, grew more attentive. A middle-aged man near the potatoes shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Snoop as if to gauge his reaction. An older couple whispered to each other, their expressions a mix of concern and curiosity. Even the cashier at the far end of the store craned her neck to get a better view, her hands pausing over the register. Every eye was on Snoop, waiting for his response. Would he lash out, walk away, raise his voice? The possibilities were endless, and the tension was almost unbearable. Snoop, however, didn't rush. He let the silence linger, let the weight of her words sink into the air. Then, slowly, he shifted his basket to his other hand and straightened his posture. His calmness was striking, almost unsettling, as if he had already decided on the best course of action. It wasn't just a decision for himself. It was a decision for everyone watching, for everyone who would hear about this moment later. In that grocery store, surrounded by carts, bananas, and bags of apples, the stage was set for something far greater than anyone could have anticipated. What happened next would leave the entire store, and perhaps Mrs. Thompson herself, forever changed. The air in the grocery store felt heavy, as if time had slowed to capture the tension in this singular moment. Snoop Dogg stood still, his calm demeanor an anchor amidst the storm of emotions swirling around the aisle. The sting of Mrs. Thompson's words hung in the air, reverberating not just through him, but through the onlookers who were now frozen in awkward silence. It would have been easy, expected even, for him to snap back, to meet her hostility with equal fire. After all, how often does anyone face such blatant ignorance without a surge of anger? But this wasn't Snoop's way. For a man who had seen the highs and lows of life, from the streets of Long Beach to global fame, he understood the power of restraint. Snoop took a deep breath, his expression thoughtful. He glanced around, noting the growing number of bystanders. Some looked worried, their gazes darting between him and Mrs. Thompson, unsure of what might happen next. Others seemed transfixed, as though witnessing a moment they would recount to friends and family later. "Ma'am," Snoop began, his voice calm and steady, cutting through the oppressive silence. His tone wasn't confrontational, nor was it dismissive. Instead, it carried an air of quiet authority, the kind that made people stop and listen. "What you just said, that's hurtful. Not just to me, but to anyone who's ever faced judgment for something they can't change." His words seemed to catch Mrs. Thompson off guard. She blinked, her defiant posture faltering slightly. It was clear she hadn't expected a measured response, let alone one delivered with such composure. "I grew up in a place where words like that were common," Snoop continued, gesturing vaguely as if to encompass the world outside the store. "But that doesn't make them right. And it doesn't mean we can't do better." The crowd around them grew stiller. If that was even possible, people leaned in, drawn to the gravity of his response. Some held their breath, as if afraid that even a whisper might disrupt the delicate balance of the moment. Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth, perhaps to retort, but Snoop held up a hand, gently but firmly. "I'm not here to argue with you, ma'am," he said. "I'm here to shop for oranges, just like you're here for your apples. We're not that different, you and I." His words carried a surprising weight, as if he were speaking not just to her, but to everyone listening. The statement hung in the air, challenging the assumptions that had led to this moment. Mrs. Thompson's expression shifted. There was still resistance in her eyes, but it was tempered now by something else, perhaps confusion, or even a hint of guilt. She tightened her grip on her shopping cart, as if it could anchor her amidst the sudden tide of introspection Snoop's words had brought. Snoop took a step closer, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't imposing, but his presence was undeniable. "I don't know what made you say what you said," he continued, his voice softer now. "Maybe it's something you were taught, or maybe it's just fear. But whatever it is, it doesn't have to define you. We all have the power to change, to grow, to do better. That's what I try to teach my kids, and that's what I hope for everyone." A murmur rippled through the small crowd. A young man in a hoodie nodded subtly, while an older woman near the end of the aisle wiped at her eyes. The tension that had gripped the store began to loosen, replaced by a different kind of energy, one of reflection and quiet admiration. Mrs. Thompson looked down at her apples, her face a mixture of emotions. She didn't respond immediately, and for a moment, it seemed like she might turn and walk away. But then, she looked up, meeting Snoop's gaze. She started, her voice shaky. "I didn't mean." Snoop smiled gently, cutting her off with a slight shake of his head. "It's okay," he said. "We've all said things we didn't mean, things we regret later. What matters is what we do next." The simplicity of his words carried a profound truth, one that resonated with everyone in earshot. It wasn't about winning an argument or proving a point. It was about creating an opportunity for understanding, for growth. Mrs. Thompson nodded slowly, her grip on the cart relaxing. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Snoop nodded in return, his smile widening. "Thank you, ma'am. That means a lot." The tension that had gripped the store dissolved completely, replaced by a sense of quiet solidarity. The onlookers began to disperse, some returning to their shopping, others lingering a moment longer to exchange glances of approval or murmured comments about what they had just witnessed. As Snoop turned back to the oranges, he glanced at a young boy who had been watching from behind a nearby display of cereal boxes. The boy grinned, giving Snoop a shy thumbs up. Snoop chuckled and returned the gesture, the moment a silent acknowledgement of the lesson he had just imparted. By the time he reached the checkout line, the store had returned to its usual rhythm. But for those who had been present, the day was anything but ordinary. They had witnessed something rare, a public figure using his platform, not for spectacle or self-promotion, but to demonstrate the power of grace under pressure. Snoop's response wasn't just about addressing Mrs. Thompson's comment. It was a reminder to everyone watching that dignity and kindness are far stronger than anger and resentment. In a world so often divided, his actions served as a beacon of hope, a call to rise above and choose understanding over conflict. And as he walked out of the store, oranges in hand, Snoop knew that the ripples of this moment would extend far beyond the aisles of that grocery store. It was a small act, a brief encounter, but sometimes that's all it takes to make a lasting impact. When the incident in the grocery store unfolded, few could have imagined how far-reaching its impact would be. What began as an uncomfortable confrontation between Snoop Dogg and Mrs. Thompson turned into a profound moment of reflection, not just for those present, but for countless others who would hear about it in the days and weeks to come. This is the essence of the ripple effect: small, seemingly ordinary actions that echo far beyond their initial scope, shaping lives and perspectives in ways we may never fully grasp. As word spread about Snoop's composed and compassionate response, the story took on a life of its own. It appeared on social media platforms, where users shared the account along with hashtags like #ChooseKindness and #Lessons from Snoop. People from all walks of life chimed in, recounting their own experiences with bias and prejudice, and how moments of grace and understanding had made a difference. One particularly poignant post came from a middle school teacher in Chicago. She shared how she had used the story in her classroom as a way to discuss empathy and conflict resolution. "It wasn't just about what Snoop said," she wrote. "It was about how he handled the situation, with respect, patience, and a willingness to educate rather than escalate. That's the kind of lesson our kids need right now." In her classroom, the students role-played scenarios where misunderstandings or biases might arise, practicing how to respond with kindness and composure. The teacher later reported that the exercise had a noticeable impact, with students becoming more mindful of their words and actions. The ripple effect didn't stop there. A small business owner in Seattle posted on LinkedIn about how the story had inspired her to implement a new diversity and inclusion workshop for her employees. "I realized that we all have unconscious biases," she wrote, "but we also have the power to address them, to grow, and to create a more welcoming environment for everyone." In another part of the world, a journalist in London wrote an op-ed reflecting on the broader implications of the incident. Snoop Dogg's response wasn't just a lesson in grace. She wrote, "It was a reminder that our reactions can either perpetuate a cycle of division or pave the way for understanding. In a time when the world feels increasingly polarized, moments like these are a beacon of hope." For Mrs. Thompson, the ripple effect was perhaps the most profound. In the days following the incident, she found herself replaying Snoop's words in her mind. His calm yet firm reminder that we all have the power to change struck a chord she hadn't expected. She began to reflect on her own upbringing, the prejudices she had absorbed without question, and the harm they had caused, not just to others, but to herself. Inspired by the outpouring of dialogue on social media, Mrs. Thompson decided to educate herself. She started reading books about racial and cultural diversity, attending local community events, and engaging in conversations she might once have avoided. It wasn't an overnight transformation, but it was a start. Months later, she wrote a letter to her local newspaper, publicly acknowledging her mistake and thanking Snoop for his grace in handling the situation. "I don't expect forgiveness from anyone," she wrote, "but I want people to know that it's never too late to change. Snoop showed me that, and for that, I'll always be grateful." The ripple effect also touched Snoop Dogg's fanbase in unexpected ways. Fans who admired him for his music and charisma now saw him in a new light. As a role model for conflict resolution and personal growth, parents began sharing the story with their children, using it as an example of how to handle difficult situations with dignity and respect. One young fan, a 10-year-old girl named Mia, wrote a letter to Snoop, saying, "I saw what you did in the store. You taught me that it's better to be kind even when people are mean. I want to be like you when I grow up." Snoop later shared Mia's letter on his Instagram, captioning it with, "It's all love. The kids are watching, and we gotta lead by example." The impact of this single encounter extended beyond individual stories to spark broader conversations about the power of kindness in addressing systemic issues. Advocacy groups began using the incident as a case study, highlighting how public figures can use their platforms to inspire positive change. Snoop's response became a talking point in panel discussions, podcasts, and even corporate training sessions. What made the moment resonate so deeply wasn't just Snoop's celebrity status. It was the authenticity of his actions, the way he chose to stand firm in his values without resorting to hostility. In an era where outrage often dominates discourse, his response was a reminder that there is strength in staying calm. That compassion can be a powerful tool for dismantling ignorance. Snoop himself reflected on the experience in a later interview. "I didn't do it for attention or applause," he said. "I did it because that's how my mom raised me. She always told me to treat people with respect, even when they don't deserve it. Because at the end of the day, it's not about them, it's about who you are." His words underscored the idea that the ripple effect isn't just about the impact we have on others. It's also about the legacy we leave for ourselves, the knowledge that we chose to act in alignment with our values, even in the face of adversity. The grocery store incident serves as a powerful reminder that our actions, no matter how small they may seem in the moment, have the potential to create waves of change. A kind word, a thoughtful gesture, or a moment of grace can inspire others to do the same, setting off a chain reaction that touches lives in ways we may never see. In the end, the ripple effect is a testament to our shared humanity, the idea that we are all interconnected, that our choices matter not just for ourselves, but for the world around us. Snoop's response, and the waves it set in motion, is a beacon of hope in a world that often feels divided. It reminds us that change begins with individuals, with moments of courage and kindness that ripple outward, transforming the world one small act at a time. Snoop Dogg's response to the racial incident at the grocery store was a powerful reminder that standing up for what's right doesn't always require shouting or physical confrontation. His calm, deliberate, and dignified approach stands in stark contrast to the expectation of a more aggressive or reactive response. In fact, his ability to remain composed in the face of direct racial insult speaks volumes about the strength of character, the importance of empathy, and the broader societal value of handling conflict with grace. At a time when emotions run high, particularly in racially charged situations, Snoop Dogg's actions serve as a guiding example for how we can all respond when faced with adversity. We live in a world where the temptation to respond with anger is ever present, especially in the face of discrimination. Whether it's a personal experience of racism, sexism, or any form of injustice, the urge to retaliate loudly and aggressively is natural. However, Snoop's choice to stand firm and respond with dignity instead of escalating the situation proves that it's often in our calmness and restraint that we find the true power to challenge injustice. But why is dignity so important in these types of encounters? To understand this, let's examine the broader context of how society has dealt with racial injustice in the past and how Snoop's response connects with these historical examples. Historical context of standing up for racial equality. One of the most prominent examples of standing up with dignity in the face of oppression comes from the civil rights movement in the United States. Figures like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. embody the essence of dignity in their approach to challenging racism. In December 1955, Rosa Parks was arrested for refusing to give up her seat to a white man on a segregated bus in Montgomery, Alabama. Her quiet act of defiance was not one of violence or shouting. It was a simple refusal to accept the degradation of her dignity. Parks wasn't trying to be a hero that day. She was tired, yes, but her refusal to give up her seat was a principled stand against the systemic racism that permeated the United States at the time. Parks' quiet strength and dignity became a symbol for the civil rights movement, showing that resistance to injustice doesn't require violence. It requires courage and the ability to maintain one's dignity in the face of overwhelming odds. Similarly, Martin Luther King Jr. is remembered for his philosophy of nonviolence. King was an advocate for confronting racism and segregation with love, understanding, and nonviolent resistance. His famous "I Have a Dream" speech called for a world where people would be judged by the content of their character, not the color of their skin. King believed that even in the face of hatred and oppression, maintaining one's dignity and responding with peace was the most powerful weapon in the fight for racial equality. His strategy of nonviolent protest led to significant societal change, demonstrating the profound impact of handling adversity with grace. Snoop Dogg, like Parks and King, has made an impact through the way he carries himself in the face of hatred. While the context may be different, Snoop's confrontation happened in a grocery store rather than a political setting. The principle remains the same. Snoop could have responded with anger, aggression, or retaliation. Instead, he chose to take a measured approach, using his voice to address the bigger issue without further escalating the conflict. In doing so, he follows in the footsteps of these civil rights giants, showing that dignity in the face of hate can lead to powerful change. The role of education in promoting dignity. One of the most significant ways to cultivate dignity in society is through education. It is through education that we begin to understand the histories and experiences of others, developing empathy and a deeper sense of respect for people who may be different from ourselves. In the case of Mrs. Thompson, the elderly woman who made the racist remark to Snoop, her behavior likely stemmed from a lack of understanding and a reliance on outdated, harmful beliefs. Education, both formal and informal, has the power to challenge these beliefs. If Mrs. Thompson had been taught the true history of racial inequality in America, if she had been given the tools to understand the systemic racism that has affected people like Snoop Dogg, perhaps her response would have been different. Snoop's family history, as he shared during the confrontation, speaks to the value of education in shaping his understanding of justice, equality, and the American dream. His grandfather fought in the Korean War for a country that did not offer him the same rights and privileges that his fellow soldiers enjoyed. Yet, he persevered, showing that the fight for dignity and equal treatment is a multi-generational struggle. In today's world, education remains a critical tool for dismantling racism and other forms of prejudice. Schools, communities, and families all have a role to play in fostering understanding and empathy. It's not enough to simply teach children the basics of math and reading. We must also teach them the values of respect, equality, and understanding. Only by instilling these values can we hope to create a society where everyone is treated with dignity, regardless of their background or identity. Leadership and the power of empathy. Snoop Dogg's ability to remain composed in the face of racial hostility is also a lesson in leadership. Leadership is not just about having power. It's about setting an example and influencing others through your actions. In the broader context of leadership, Snoop's approach to conflict resolution highlights the importance of empathy. Empathy allows leaders to see the situation from all sides and respond in a way that seeks to heal rather than divide. This is particularly important in moments of tension, where emotions can cloud judgment and escalate conflict. Snoop's ability to assess the situation, reflect on his options, and then speak calmly but firmly shows that leadership often requires restraint and wisdom. Consider the leadership of Nelson Mandela as another example of dignity in the face of adversity. Mandela spent 27 years in prison under apartheid in South Africa. Yet when he was released, he chose not to seek revenge, but to promote reconciliation and peace. He understood that the only way forward for South Africa was through empathy and understanding, not through retaliation. His leadership transformed a nation and inspired the world. Similarly, Snoop's approach to handling racism with grace was an act of leadership that influenced everyone around him. His decision to stand tall without lashing out showed those watching that we all have a choice in how we respond to hate. It's not about being a passive bystander. It's about choosing to confront hate with dignity and setting a standard for how to handle conflict in a productive and empathetic way. Moving forward with dignity. As we look to the future, particularly in 2025, we must remember that standing up with dignity in the face of adversity is more important than ever. The world is increasingly interconnected, and we are confronted with issues of racial, gender, and cultural inequality daily. It's not enough to be silent or indifferent. We must take a stand, but we must do so in a way that fosters understanding and promotes healing. Snoop Dogg's actions remind us that we don't have to fight fire with fire. We don't need to mirror hate with more hate. Instead, we can stand firm in our values and beliefs, showing that strength and dignity are far more powerful than anger. His response to racism was not just about defending himself. It was about teaching others how to handle hate with respect, how to choose grace over aggression, and how to challenge injustice without perpetuating further division. As we move forward into 2025, let Snoop's example be a beacon of hope and a reminder that each of us has the power to make a difference. Whether we're in a grocery store, a school, a workplace, or any other setting, we can choose to stand up with dignity, to speak out against injustice, and to lead with empathy. By doing so, we honor not only our own dignity, but the dignity of others. We contribute to a world where respect, equality, and understanding are not just ideals, but lived realities for everyone. In a world that is continually evolving, where systemic issues such as racism, inequality, and injustice remain deeply entrenched, it is more important than ever to reflect on the lessons we can learn from those who have confronted adversity with dignity, grace, and unwavering strength. Throughout this video, we have explored Snoop Dogg's remarkable response to racism in a grocery store, examining how his measured, dignified reaction to a moment of hate has the potential to resonate far beyond that single instance. Snoop's choice to face racism not with violence or anger, but with understanding, a firm stance, and respect for his own dignity has proven that powerful change does not always come from grand gestures. It often comes from the quiet moments when we choose not to engage in the cycle of hate and retaliation. His response teaches us that standing up for what's right can be achieved with respect, compassion, and by holding on to our integrity, even when confronted with hostility. But why does this matter? Why should we care? Because the ripple effects of actions like Snoop's reverberate far beyond the individual. His response is not just a personal triumph. It is a universal lesson that each of us can learn from and apply in our daily lives. The fight for dignity, equality, and respect is not a fight for the few, but for the many. It is a fight that affects all of us, regardless of our race, gender, or social standing. If we want to see lasting change, we must be willing to commit to a path that upholds dignity, empathy, and understanding in all of our interactions, embracing the power of dignity in our own lives. Snoop's response, while unique to him, has universal application. We can all learn to approach difficult situations with grace. Even when we feel attacked or marginalized, we can choose to handle insults, discrimination, or injustice with the same quiet strength that Snoop demonstrated. But more than that, we can actively cultivate this strength within ourselves through practice, introspection, and, most importantly, through understanding. Standing up with dignity doesn't mean we have to remain silent when we witness racism, sexism, or any form of injustice. It doesn't mean we should tolerate discrimination or allow ourselves to be passive in the face of harm. Instead, standing up with dignity means confronting these issues in a way that encourages positive change rather than perpetuating the cycle of hate. It means using our words and actions to create an environment where understanding and mutual respect thrive. To make this shift in our thinking and behavior requires deliberate action. It requires us to reflect on our own biases, to engage in continuous self-education, and to hold ourselves accountable when we slip into old, unhelpful patterns of behavior. It requires a willingness to not only stand up for ourselves, but to also stand up for others, especially those who may be vulnerable, marginalized, or overlooked. The importance of leadership in the fight for dignity. As we consider Snoop's example and reflect on the broader analysis of dignity and leadership, it is clear that leadership, true leadership, is rooted in empathy, respect, and the ability to listen. In 2025, leadership is no longer defined solely by titles or positions of power. It is defined by the impact we have on others, the way we uplift and empower those around us, and the example we set in how we engage with the world. Leaders are not simply individuals who make decisions for others. They are individuals who inspire others through their actions. They lead by example, showing that leadership is about making the hard choices that put dignity and respect above self-interest. Leadership is about taking the high road even when the path is difficult and unpopular. Whether you are a community leader, a parent, a teacher, a boss, or simply someone who wants to see a more just and equal world, you have the opportunity to lead by demonstrating dignity in your interactions with others. Leadership is about fostering environments where people feel valued, heard, and respected. It's about creating spaces where empathy and compassion are the norm, not the exception. By leading with dignity, we make a lasting impact on our communities, workplaces, and relationships. The example we set becomes a blueprint for others to follow. And just like Snoop's reaction to racism in the grocery store, our actions can inspire others to act with integrity, courage, and compassion when faced with similar challenges. Education as a tool for transformation. As we have discussed throughout this video, one of the most important tools we have in the fight for dignity and equality is education. Education empowers individuals to recognize injustice and challenge harmful systems and attitudes. It provides the foundation for empathy, understanding, and respect, helping to break down barriers that divide us. To move toward a more equitable world, we must place a renewed emphasis on education, not just in the classroom but in our communities and homes. Teaching our children and ourselves the value of diversity, inclusion, and empathy is crucial. We must make it our responsibility to educate not only about the historical roots of racism and inequality, but also about how we can dismantle those systems today. The fight for dignity begins with the belief that everyone, regardless of their race, gender, or background, deserves respect. It's about recognizing that we all have a role to play in creating a more inclusive society. This begins with the small, everyday actions we take to ensure that we treat others with kindness and fairness. It also extends to the larger societal changes that we advocate for in the workplace, in our communities, and in politics. If you are a parent, take the time to teach your children the importance of respect, empathy, and fairness. If you are an educator, consider how you can foster a classroom environment that celebrates diversity and promotes understanding. If you are a community leader, think about the ways you can create spaces where people from all walks of life can come together to share their stories and experiences. The more we educate ourselves and others, the more equipped we become to face the challenges that lie ahead. Education is the foundation for building a society where dignity is not just an ideal but a reality for everyone. Taking action today for a better tomorrow. So, what can you do today to stand up with dignity? What actions can you take right now to contribute to a world where empathy, respect, and equality are the norms? Start by reflecting on your own behavior. Ask yourself, how do I respond when I encounter discrimination or hate? Do I react with anger? Or do I take a moment to reflect and respond with dignity? Every day, we face moments where we have the opportunity to make a choice. We can choose to rise above the negativity and engage with others in a way that fosters respect and understanding. Beyond individual reflection, we must also look at the bigger picture. We must engage in conversations that challenge harmful attitudes and behaviors. We must advocate for policies and practices that promote equality and ensure that every person's dignity is upheld. This means supporting initiatives and organizations that work to eradicate racism and other forms of discrimination. It means amplifying the voices of those who have been marginalized and oppressed. Snoop Dogg's calm yet powerful response to racism in a grocery store is an example of how one person's actions can send ripples of change throughout society. It shows that standing up for what's right doesn't always require grand gestures or loud protests. It can be as simple as standing firm in your values, speaking out when necessary, and demonstrating compassion in the face of hostility. As we move forward into 2025 and beyond, let's make a commitment to uphold the dignity of ourselves and others. Let's make it our mission to lead with empathy, respect, and understanding. Together, we can create a world where every person is treated with the dignity they deserve. A world where equality is not just an aspiration but a reality. A final thought. To close, I want to leave you with this. The fight for dignity is not a fight for the few. It is a fight for all of us. It's a fight that calls us to rise above the hate and division that have too often defined our world. It's a fight that asks us to challenge the systems that perpetuate injustice and to build a future where every person is valued for who they are, not the color of their skin, their gender, or their background. You have the power to make a difference. You have the power to stand up for what's right with dignity and grace, just as Snoop Dogg did. Every time you choose to respond to hate with love, to challenge injustice with understanding, and to lead with empathy, you are contributing to a world that is more just, more equal, and more compassionate. So, I encourage you, reflect on what you've learned today. Take action in your own life. Speak out against hate. Embrace dignity in your interactions, and encourage others to do the same. The change starts with you. And remember, it's not just about fighting for dignity today, it's about building a better tomorrow for everyone.